Welcome to Redefine the Circle, a podcast where we discuss all things pitching. I'm Ashley Sunshine, co-owner and head of pitching development at S2 Breakthrough. In this podcast, we're going to highlight topics that focus on how to maximize your pitchers now. We're going to discuss some of the trends that we've seen at S2 Breakthrough and talk about how we use data to create systems and training approaches that are specific to each pitcher. It's so important for us to continue to share this information and facilitate discussion within the pitching community so we can keep evolving as coaches and ultimately grow pitching into something it's never been before. Thanks so much for listening, and thanks for joining the quest to redefine the circle. Hi everyone, welcome back to Redefine the Circle. I'm Ashley Sunshine, co-owner and head of pitching development here at S2 Breakthrough. We are in episode 2 of series 6, where we are continuing our discussion about how patterns relate to ball flight, and more specifically, what it looks like when a pitcher's ball flight data is something special, but her patterns are less than optimal, and why it's really important for us to understand exactly how that relationship is connected between patterns and ball flight to make sure that we understand what it is that allows that pitcher to be as special as she is. This series is all about making sure that we don't find ourselves in this world of assessments really just trying to get pitchers to all chase something generic or all try to become more optimal or more efficient. There's no doubt about it when we're talking about working with young pitchers and we're trying to build them from the ground up. We're trying to keep them as clean of a slate as possible to allow them to achieve as much as possible. But particularly when we're working with pitchers a little bit later in their career, sometimes later in their career even means high school, depending on what it is that's going on with their body and their patterns and how ingrained things are. And sometimes, as in the case of last week's example, in the case of this week's example, we're talking about a pitcher late in her career in college, and we know that that pitcher is at a certain level because of something special in her ball flight. And it's really important in the assessment process that we understand not only what is it that makes her special, but what is it in her patterns, whether it's optimal or not? What is it about her patterns that allows her to achieve that? Because it's so important that we don't make recommendations for pitchers to do something with their patterns that actually impacts what allows them to achieve something special when it comes to break, when it comes to velo, etc. So today's example is another case study where we're going to walk through a collegiate level pitcher at the end of her career, and we're going to look at what her patterns are. We're going to look at her 4D motion sports data to look at her biomechanics, what's going on with her trunk, look at some high-speed video, and ultimately talk about what's going on with her patterns. And if we didn't really know anything about this pitcher and her ball flight, and we were simply chasing something generic or optimal, what might be the recommendations we would give, and why it's important that we see the whole story, or we see all the pieces of her puzzle all together on the table and make sure that we understand how they fit together before we give a recommendation for that pitcher. So let's go ahead and turn our heads, her eyes here to the screen at my computer, and let's look at this example. So let's start with this pitcher's 4D first and foremost. And let's just assume that we are talking about, okay, we are trying to make recommendations for what's optimal, or maybe, what this pitcher needs to clean up. And so as I'm getting this 4D graph scrolling, we've gone through many 4D graphs in the last couple of episodes in the past few series. But for those of you maybe who are joining or are new to this podcast, we're looking at the trunk as a whole, pelvis on the left, chest on the right, 3 planes of movement and rotation, this forward and back plane or sagittal plane, and the side-to-side plane here in blue. So when I'm looking at a pitcher's graph, first thing I want to look at is what's going on in the load. Again, let's assume that we're going to point out all of the inefficiencies in this pitcher's motion. I'm going to say things like, okay, this is excessive. We're usually looking at about 40, 45 degrees of load. She's at over 60, over 70 with chest. So a lot of chest-led movements, generally just really collapse and excessive in her load. And then this break here. So as I continue to work this forward, what I'm going to see is that this break in the slope of this green line, what it shows is that this pitcher essentially totally stands up out of that load and then launches from nearly nothing. So she's in a little bit of a hinge, about 29 degrees, less than 9 with her chest. So she really has drastically changed the positioning of her trunk in this transition from load to launch. And so as we continue to get this graph going, what we're going to see is that what happens is that she gets into sort of anti-rotation. We're usually looking at about maybe 55, 60 degrees of rotation here in the pelvis. We're only at about 35, 30, 37 degrees. We're seeing that she's going into, about to go into a lot of hyperextension and hike in the chest, which normally we'd love to see these blue graphs and green graphs where the chest stay nice and close to zero, that the chest is staying steady. But you can see she's doing all the launching from the chest. So what we'll see in this picture's high speed graph, she uses her stride leg to achieve her launch. She didn't have a really ground up approach, not a lot of rotation there, a lot of hike and a lot of extension through the back. And so as a result, when she gets to the top of her arm circle, and we're looking at our max rotation, even though she achieves decent max rotation numbers, she kind of gets stuck there. And we can see this almost right away in this visual where this pelvis graph and rotation is going to cut off really early, but it's really like an anti-rotation type of motion. And instead, she just kind of stays in extension. So watching this green graph here in the chest, it just stays below zero as she's coming through. So she's going to stay in extension and have this big kind of loss of posture in this deceleration phase. There's no doubt about it. Inefficient load here. We're excessive, and then she stands up prior to launch. She's really using all of the chest and all of this extension through the back to launch. She gets stuck and is not able to rotate back well. Deceleration is not efficient. There's no doubt about it. Like, there are a ton of inefficiencies here. So if we only looked at biomechanics sort of in a vacuum, that we were just like, okay, let's look at this pitcher's biomechanics and let's give recommendations on how she should attack pitching based on only this information, that would be a whole different story. But that is not how we attack assessments, and this is why we can't attack them this way.
My name is Carly Sewell, and I'm the Director of Strength and Conditioning for S2 Breakthrough. I'm thrilled to announce the release of my course. This is the first ever Strength and Conditioning course from S2 Breakthrough, and we're going to deep dive into my methods that have built a system of training elite softball players year-round. Hope you guys join me in it.
RTC listeners can save 10% off of Strength and Conditioning Redefined by using code RTC10 at the link in the description. Let's turn our eyes back to the screen. As we're scrolling, let's actually look at this picture. And as we're getting going, we know that whenever there are a lot of energy leaks or inefficiencies in a pitcher's motion, what we can expect to see then is a lot of strategies to be able to accomplish what she needs to. So we can see this kind of big move. We know that she's going to stand up a lot in her launch. And right away, what we can see from this behind view, this will be a little bit more apparent when I get a closer view, but because she does all the launching through a lot of extension in the back, she really sends herself off into kind of like the wrong direction, meaning as she extends that, lifts the chest, extends the back, it really loads the wrong side of the body, the wrong sling. Directionally, she's going to get sent. She's a left-handed pitcher, so she's going to get sent to the right. You can see that here in her stride. It's coming way off to the right. So she's really excessive because she gets her launch not from the ground and is using, again, extension, a lot of her stride leg, a lot of hike. That's how she buys her air time. Not only is she going to land really kind of far off to the right, so she's kind of directionally not in a great position, meaning her landing kind of takes her stride foot takes her off to the right, but she's got to rotate back. And whenever we see that directionally a pitcher was launched in poor position, then the rotation back toward the target is usually compromised, which will certainly be the case with this pitcher. And again, we saw that here. So difficult to see direction here in 4D, but we can certainly see that that's an issue, and that's why we're seeing such excessive hike here. It's because everything is getting sent over here toward the right side, even though the task for her is going in this direction. So let's continue to follow this. What we're going to see then is really typical whenever a pitcher is really launched in the wrong direction. Here's that excessive hike through the hip. We can see that the chest, all of that like poor deceleration, you can see she's collapsing. She almost looks like tilted in this direction. That's really common, again, as the energy or her launch got sent to the right, but the task is this way, it's almost like her body is sort of like fighting itself regarding the direction in which it's trying to go. This is why rotation gets stuck. We can see her sort of anchored back here. Again, this is what matches what's going on here with these graphs. And particularly with this like lack of rotation. Okay, so that's what we're seeing. These are her strategies. And so again, we could still look at this 4D graph. We could still look at her biomechanics, energy leaks, see all of these issues with the strategies in which she's using. There's no doubt about it. Let's say this pitcher was 14 years old, 15 years old, early in her career. We would likely want to clean some of this stuff up because the more inefficiencies there are, the more limited you are in what you can achieve. But that's not the story for this pitcher. What we know about this pitcher is that she's in the last year of her career. She's playing at a high level, in the Power 5 level. She has something very special about her, obviously. So we need to take all of those variables into account, and we have to make sure that we are looking at biomechanics and patterns as a whole, not just as a way of like, let's point out what's good and what's bad. That is way too generic. It's not so black and white. Instead, it's let's understand why she does what she does. What does she get away with? What's okay for her? What may not be okay? And ultimately, what's great about her already? What in her patterns is linked to that? And how do we make sure we preserve it? So if we're trying to make something better, it can't be at the cost of maybe unraveling what makes her good in the first place. So again, no doubt about it, inefficiencies. We can see that in biomechanics. We can see that her strategies and compensations to get away from where her trunk is really not holding up its end of the deal. No doubt about it. This is not sort of like the ideal motion, this optimal patterns. We can see that clear as day. Okay, so let's keep shifting. What do we know about this pitcher other than the variables of, she's in the last year of her career, she's already pitching at a high level. Let's look at the details. What's going on with her ball flight? Shifting back over. What we see here is that this pitcher, as a lefty, everything here, you can see she has glove side run, and there's something pretty significant about her. So when we look here, she's got an off speed, and everything is essentially the same. Everything sort of takes on the same shape here, each of the pitches that she throws. And what I mean by that, there's really no pitch that's achieving a significantly different spin profile. She's got a top spin on everything, pretty significant, about 6 to 7 inches, depending on what she's throwing. She's got this curve. She's got a back door, the ability to throw both ends of the plate, both sides of the plate. And then really significant about her, we are looking at about 4 to 5 inches of horizontal movement here, which is no doubt about it. That amount of run of that horizontal break that she has is really, really special about her. So her ability, these pitches are sinking. She blends a great off speed. But this horizontal movement is something really, really special. So understanding how she's able to achieve that is critical. When we're looking up here and glancing at just where she is with a velo standpoint, she's sitting about 61, 62, up to about 64, 65. So certainly not like a low velo pitcher. For the Power 5 level, someone might argue that's on the lower end. But this is a pitcher who's had a lot of success and had a lot of success throughout the year. And again, we really want to understand why this is what's going on. So now the next step in this process is, okay, we want to make sure that we are preserving her ability to break the way she does. It's not just sink, it's this horizontal piece that's really, really critical. It's the ability for her, again, as a lefty, she's throwing it to both halves of the plate. She's sinking it with a great off speed. We want to know, how is she able to do that? Something else that's worth noting, this pitcher had no pain. No injury history, no pain going on. So, to the degree that which we come in and a pitcher has something special, but pain, from a ball flight standpoint, but pain is in the equation, we have to really approach this conversation about making changes to patterns and those types of things a little bit more delicately, because we don't want pain to be sort of the cost of ball flight. It doesn't have to be one or the other. But in this case, we weren't talking about that. We're really simply talking about preserving what really is great about this pitcher and understanding, how does she do that? What are the things that allow her to achieve this? So let's keep rolling. I have a closer, just a little bit of a closer view from this behind view. Let's watch this pitcher's patterns a little bit closer. We can see that as she takes off, We know from her trunk graph, her 4D graphs, that she's really upright. She immediately goes into this extension. It's going to load the wrong side of the body, this wrong sling concept, and she's going to get sent to the right. So now this is important. Remember, we're no longer talking about her patterns as a sense of like, is it efficient? Is it not? Is it good or is it bad? We are simply talking about how is she achieving what she's achieving on the ball. So we can see that she's going to get sent out in that direction. We're going to have a little bit of a excessive hike, excessive extension. Something else I want to point out about this picture, because she's so lever dominant, meaning her stride leg does so much, she's really not working ground up. Her trunk arm timing is actually pretty poor, meaning watch when that stride foot comes down. So I'm watching this foot here. When it actually lands on the ground, she's in layback already. Another thing to point out, you can see she's actually in the opposite of what we would say like an ideal layback position is, meaning she's actually face down on the ball. The reason for that is because when direction is an issue, so if we're launching to the opposite, left-handed pitcher, so she's launching to the right, this is a wrong sling, wrong direction concept, then as the arm crosses the midline, we kind of looked at this in the example last week, then the shoulder then has to rotate excessively and usually gets stuck in some internal rotation. So she is going to be really face down on the ball. Is this ideal? Definitely not. Is her trunk arm timing ideal? Definitely not. But it's worth pointing out because basically what I want to show you is this is what's happening with the ball. She's going to be limited in time. So her brain knows that she can't deliver the ball just face down like this. It knows it has to sort of, have a strategy for, kind of getting back behind the ball or turning the forearm, essentially, some sort of flip. So this is where that will happen. Take a look. So as she's coming down and she's trying to get closer toward approaching the body, you'll see she has this strategy to sort of then cut inside the ball. She's really limited in her timing, again, because of that trunk arm timing. What we also know is because of this directional concept, she's really hiked out into this right side, and it's preventing this side of the body, the dominant side of the body, from then being able to rotate back to the target. Because her body's kind of pulling in separate directions, she gets stuck. But as a result of that, watch what happens with her hand. Essentially, her hand is going to do all of the rotating. So she's going to get really behind the ball. This is really common. A lot of like anti-rotators. We're going to see a lot of like top spin here because of this. The arm is doing all that rotating because the trunk is not doing it. But watch, it gets excessive, and take a look at her fingers here. Watch that sort of middle finger and the index finger. That middle finger will stay on the ball a little bit longer. They really sort of like curl around that top layer of the ball here. This is where that horizontal spin and that horizontal break comes from. Let's watch that a little closer. Here's the top spin component, 2 fingers. Keep watching as it comes through. Watch how those 2 fingers really peel. I'm going to be real slow here and really get to the side of the ball. And that allows her to get that horizontal piece. Now, a couple things all went into that. Is her timing ideal? No. There's a reason why when we looked at her ball flight data, basically all of her pitches do the same thing. That is common. When we see that someone is in poor trunk arm timing, meaning their stride foot lands and they're already at layback, especially when they're in poor trunk arm timing and they have a compromised layback position. In this case, she was face down or totally pronated. Forearm was totally pronated, meaning that she has only enough time, limited amount of time, and during that time has to flip in order to make sure that there's some rotation involved in that forearm to get energy out to the ball. The brain knows this. It's complex. The body's complex. The brain understands what it has to do to accomplish the task. So it has to do all that in this minimal amount of time. Basically, there is no time for variability. It only has time to accomplish just that. It only has time for that flip strategy, and it lined up essentially for this pitcher, not necessarily conscious for her. She wasn't consciously trying to achieve, a horizontal break on this, but the timing in which she gives herself puts her behind the ball, and then she excessively kind of rotates those fingers around it. So again, taking a look at the screen, look at that finger position, right at the release, right at the point of delivery. And that's going to be the case for all of the pitches that she throws, which is, again, why we're seeing everything cluster here. It's important to understand this is what makes this pitcher great. So it is so critical to make sure that we get that this directional component is related. The more off direction she is why the arm kind of takes on so much of that rotation. It's because as the back end of the body doesn't rotate as much, the arm is doing it for it. That's related to the horizontal. The fact that she's in so much hike because of her strategies gives her less, so it's worse trunk arm timing, but that time frame sort of syncs up exactly where it puts her hands on, to put her fingers in position on the ball to allow her to achieve what she does. So instead of taking the approach in this assessment process of clean this up, clean this up, clean this up, instead we really want to approach this with understand what she's achieving, what makes her special from a ball flight, and why is she achieving that? What's related to that? Make sure we're not attacking things that are inefficient. They are, no doubt about it, that things that are inefficient in her patterns because they're inefficient. And then as a risk of that is that we just derail the spin that we're looking for. Again, it's not a young pitcher. She's not sort of early on in her career, even midway through her career. This is the very end of her career, and she's pain-free currently at the point of this assessment. So it's just so critical to understand that. Let's take our eyes back to the screen. A couple things I want to point out. This was this athlete's mobility assessment. So when we looked at how well the body could move, she was totally green and actually had some hypermobility. I think a lot of people talk about hypermobility. It's actually very, very rare, particularly with college level athletes. But this pitcher did have hypermobility in the back, so in the thoracic region and in the femur, in her drag leg here. So really important to understand, like we were talking about some hypermobility, and likely the reason why she was able to achieve what she could achieve, the reason why she could have inefficient patterns and be pain-free is because her body had this excessive mobility to keep working through all these positions. That sort of, we looked at her graph and we saw that her chest extension just stayed in extension the entire time through the motion. Most pitchers would never be able to sit in extension like that, and she could because of this hypermobility. So this is something that sort of like really allows her to get away with those inefficiencies and those poor patterns. Again, I talked about this in last episodes, but it's really important that we don't just look at a pitcher who's successful and has good ball flight data and then try to like teach their patterns to other pitchers. It's something so unique to them. Very, very often, great pitchers with great ball flight have poor patterns. And I think this is something that's really, really important to note. And that's something that in this case, is true. For this pitcher, there's no doubt about it. She's a little bit more limited in variability. So that's something, again, if early on in her career, we didn't want to cap her to being only able to achieve one spin direction or one type of break, that's something that's limiting her because of her patterns. And, maybe a little bit of obviously there's a lot of energy leaks there. So I think she's able to keep more energy in the system than most pitchers would with these patterns because of that hypermobility. But there's energy leaks, and for sure velo is on the table and being left out because of those patterns. So she's definitely sacrificing some things. But at this stage of her career, what we want to make sure that we do is preserve, that really, really great break, a little bit of that sink, and of course that horizontal movement. Moving over to the screen, one last thing that I do want to talk about is that this pitcher, her stability as a whole was low in assessment. So we were looking at when she was on the ground, particularly in the sagittal plane, how well could she control the trunk? And she struggled to really command the posterior side of the body and really engage the back side of the body. Anterior core was pretty severe in its breakdown. Anything in the air, she had some loss of posture and even collapsed a little bit in the frontal plane, like a knee collapse in her landing. So our recommendation really for this athlete would be when you are going throughout the year, we want to make sure we're obviously continuously monitoring ball flight data, make sure that there's no regressions in what we're seeing that is special about you. We want to make sure that you preserve your mobility profile, because if that mobility starts to all of a sudden regress, you may no longer be able to get away with what you're getting away with. So watching that mobility profile, keeping that a priority, making sure it stays clean, especially as workload goes up throughout the season. And then if anything, from a standpoint of attacking something, attacking stability, making sure anterior core is strong. Essentially, even if this pitcher kept her patterns during load, during top of arm circle, we didn't change the direction in which she was launching. We left all that alone, which again, I think is important to do to allow her to achieve all that horizontal movement on the ball. What we do want to make sure, I think she probably could add a little bit of velo if deceleration was just a little bit stronger. Anterior core could help her put on the brakes a little bit more. Generally, the backside of the body was a little bit more, was contributing a little bit more, and she's a little more stable while in the air. So just making sure from a strength and conditioning standpoint, stability is improving, I think, is the main recommendation for this pitcher. And everything else is just understand the relationship of all these variables, understand the relationship of all of those pattern or biomechanics pieces with when you launch in the wrong direction, when you're hiking, why the timing of all that excessive hike contributes to the break you have, why the direction, why the anti-rotation in your motion contributes to the break you have, why the mobility and the excessive mobility really allows you to get away with that. So just understanding how all those pieces connect, making sure that's clear to both the pitcher and her coaching staff. And again, throughout the year, making sure that that's clear enough that they can watch that story, have a handle on that story. And if ball flight starts to shift, they don't feel like we don't know why, what's happened or what's changed. They know exactly what it is that connects to what. And they can go right ahead and target, okay, let's do a mobility check. Let's take a look at her or at some high-speed video. Let's see what's different. And let's really work backward to make sure we can sort of like restore where this pitcher was during assessment time. So I thought this was a really great example. It's really, really sort of different types of mechanics. I think it's so important to understand. Last episode, I titled it something like optimal is not always ideal. And I think when we're talking about high-level pitchers, elite-level pitchers who have something special, we already know they have something special. Maybe there's something, again, they're late in their careers and it's not the time to be messing and adding things, but instead understanding their story and preserving what makes them great. I just thought this was a really great example. It's kind of a different example. I think that it really kind of hammers this point home of no two pitchers are alike, and why they achieve what they achieve is unique only to them. And assessment processes are about understanding that story. And never, ever should we look at the details of a pitcher and try to take them and then just place them on another pitcher. That is never the way to go. The body is too complex for that, and it's too individualized. So hopefully that story was really helpful for some people to just kind of take those concepts in, really hammer home another case study to understand this really complex and highly individualized process of the assessment and just pitching as a whole. So thank you, as always, for listening, for joining. Make sure you check this episode out on YouTube if you were only listening today to be able to follow all of these visuals between now and next week. Be sure to keep questing on to redefine the circle, everyone. Thanks for joining again. We'll see you next time. Thanks for listening to today's episode. I'd love to connect and hear your feedback. You can contact me directly at ashley@s2breakthrough.com. If you're listening, you can leave us a review, or if you're watching, go ahead and leave a comment below. Also, be sure to follow S2 Breakthrough on all of our social media channels and subscribe to Stream S2 to find all things player development. Until next time, quest on.